Okay, so here we are, feet on the ground. Willa calling us to let ourselves be breathed, because we are part of this enormous living organism. Gratefully. And so we'll go around this circle, and if you could offer something that you can shed outside the gate for this time together. Oh, thank you. Oh, and thank you to Diana for, look who came.
She wouldn't have missed it for the world.
And this being has been schlepped from Boston to San Francisco to Santa Fe.
Oh, into the outer space.
And from outer space to Boston to, yeah. So something you can shed outside the gate for these 2 days, or something you're feeling in this moment. Let's just go around. Who would like to start?
So I was going to say, I would put aside concern about my husband and his recent illness, which has been very much on my mind. Then I'll do that. I spoke to him this morning, so I'm okay. I'll be brief. But I think I'll say I want to shed the feeling that that I'm getting old and out to pasture.
I'd like to shed complexity, a layered life with constant bombardment from all directions, and thinking about the past as I think about the future, and as I think about next week and the week after and what I just did. And all of the kind of pins and needles poking of a very overwhelming life. I would like to be in a beautiful place with beautiful people and only here now.
Not much to add to that.
That's true.
Well, I will shed for the moment that I'm here, that I need to arrange my life differently, that I can be here. I have made the stupid mistake of thinking I'm going home tomorrow. And as of tomorrow afternoon, I have a full schedule, and on Friday as well. So I need to completely change everything. And it's really, really terrible timing to make that mistake. But anyway, so while I'm here, I'm going to try to be here. And then I have to run to make, phone calls and emails and rearrange my entire schedule so that I can come back and be here.
Susie, I'm glad you're going to do that. Thank you. I'm going to shed a bad week that I had last week. Not a personal one particularly, but one which comes right as I'm coming to this. So I'm working on coral reefs, as you guys know, and I've had some really bad news about the state of some reefs that I'll be working on in the next 6 months. And it's due to climate change, and it's devastating. And so being here, I'm really hoping to shed my worry about that and to just sort of be in the moment and try to make this the opportunity to work through that and figure out how to deal with it.
I'm going to try to shed the small stuff and just be here with all of you with the big stuff.
And I'm good. I'm here.
Ever since I started thinking about climate change, I've been troubled by the question, of what do you say to the person who says, how much electricity I use doesn't make any difference because there's so many human beings. Or the people who say, well, that's not going to happen till after I die. Well, of course, it's happening faster than they thought. In other words, how do we live the perception of interconnectedness that is, of course, the living entity of the planet? And I have a sense that being part of this group, meeting over a period of time on a regular basis, has certainly changed what I have been doing in this period of time. And I've been bringing it to other groups that I belong to, and of course I had done some writing about environmental things before, but well, I think we're building the molecular structure of a solution, and I think that's very important. We all know the slogan, think globally, act locally, but the point is we have to see that the local is connected to the global. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense. So just simply meeting together, I think probably each of us has been inspired in different ways in the way we do our work out of this.
Thank you.
Well, at first I thought this was something to shed, but maybe it's more something to share, to carry and share. So I don't know if any of you saw the latest issue of Nature Climate Change, the scientific journal. There's an article there by a big group of researchers, many at MIT, some that I know. And it looks at the long-term irreversible impacts of climate change, especially sea level rise. But I was just floored by the last sentence of the abstract, which said that I can't quite quote it, but basically our analysis shows that decisions made in the next years to decades will have impacts on human beings, the earth, and ecosystems for tens of millennia. And, just like, the question then is like, what am I doing with these years and decades? And where is that balance point, like cook the soup and be a mom and drive the carpool during the 10 years that are going to affect the next 10 millennia? Or ditch all of that and like, what is that? So I've just been circling in my head of, am I using those 10 years the way I want to be using them? And I don't want to shed that because I think it's a key question, but I want to stop just cycling in my own head and share it.
I think mine is kind of mundane, which is just I'm not going to look at those emails about, you didn't have enough names of who you were having lunch with on your receipt, and has the contract for who's going to take Naomi Klein back to the hotel, is that signed, and this endless barrage of all very important in their own tiny way. Contacts that we, in our brain cells, are dancing in, all for something bigger. And thank God for that. I feel lucky to be working on that. But I'm going to shed, I hope, opening the phone and looking at those emails. So I sensed that we would all really benefit ourselves and each other from hearing from each of us with some spaciousness about what's happened in our own work on this, thinking about this in the last year since we've actually been together. It's actually almost a year and a half. our last meeting was right before the climate march in September. So I thought we would go around and hear from each of us in whatever detail or not detail you'd like to share about what we've actually been thinking about, doing, working on. What is the cutting sort of alive for you right now in what you're working on in relationship to this? And obviously we can't be comprehensive about it, so you have to sort of choose. But 5 minutes, 7 minutes, whatever you need to share what it is that's happening for you right now in terms of your work in relationship to this, your being in relationship to this issue. And also, what has changed, which is part of what you had raised in your question, Beth, but just what has changed for you, perhaps, since we were all together in how you're addressing this. So, who would ever like to start?
I can start.
Yeah.
I really struggled to remember when the last. I was like, how long has it been? It felt like yesterday, and it also felt like years ago. And I was like, what has happened since then? And what was our last conversation? And where did we leave things? So knowing that it was right before the climate march helps to. Okay. So my book came out in December of 2014, and within 3 weeks, the first edition had sold out, which was amazing. And then the second printing did well, and it was translated to German, and I was asked to speak and travel, and all the while I'm thinking, where can I get to that I feel comfortable with being on a plane or driving my car or living still in a society that doesn't seem to be making movements quick enough. Meanwhile, we have this tremendous drought in California, and I was on some level quite proud that people stepped up and cut back. But at the same time, we're still flushing toilets and throwing away our good drinking water, and I'm wondering, why aren't there water catchment things in place and so on? So I think overall, my trajectory from our last meeting till now has been trying to become the change I wish to see. So, it was a huge help to live in a space that's powered by wind and solar. Like just having that weight off your shoulders of when I turn on a light switch, it's almost a little celebration of like, that's the sun, or that's the wind, helped. And then I started growing things in my garden and teaching my daughter and sharing those experiences with her, even just on a very small scale, because we were so sensitive about the drought. We were like, how much can we do? So we just literally had one of those barrel cut things, and we grew tomatoes in there and green beans and all these things. It's one little barrel that we could water once a week. So it's a tiny thing, but I felt like I was starting to restructure my mind. At the same time, I think you've all heard this story of me doing my daughter's tree, ancestral tree, and finding about her history and my history, and the more these stories took me further and further back, the more I felt like there's something there, and it needs to be examined, and it led me to doing this portrait project, in which I'm asking my subjects to sort of speak through the lens to their descendants in this one pose, this one gesture. If this is the image that survives 200 years from now, what do you want them to know about you in your gaze? And it's been incredibly powerful. But at the same time, like, how is this helping the planet? How is this how is this, you know, like you said, if we've only got decades or years, how is this helping? I have been asked to go back to Antarctica, and I feel very conflicted about it. So for me, in general, it's been a lot of going in. I've been spending a lot of time inward, and revisiting old habits of traditional beadwork and making things, and sort of going back to glass, metal, wood, instead of plastic. I had to remind myself that 100 years ago, plastic did not exist. Bakelite still was in its infancy, and yet plastic has become this tremendous, ubiquitous poison, and also a great mystery and gift that we are squandering. So I've been spending a lot of time thinking about the little things to the big things, the little things to the big things, and going back into my own history, and then projecting forward hundreds or thousands of years. And I think overall, the feeling I have been getting from my environment is not one of changing, but like changing to preserve what is this now, but adapting to what is the new. I wouldn't, it's not a surrender by any means, but it is an awareness that things have been altered beyond repair in some realms, and that's connected. And so knowing that these alterations have occurred, how will we adapt? And so I'm working on those adaptations within my own life so that I can project that out. And that's my world. Anybody?
We'll go around the circle. Yeah.
So lately, I've really found myself kind of zeroing in on a commitment to my work in the world being very local and having to do with community, and really committing to that as a place of being. And so as a teacher, I get invitations to go beyond where I live, and I've not wanted to do that and wanted to stay in community and think about how transformation can happen on a small scale within a community, communal transformation that is fed by inner transformation. So I've been thinking a lot lately about the relationship between inner transformation and outer transformation. In the Buddhist world at the moment, there's a kind of debate around. There's a lot of discussion around social action and social justice and the environment. There's a growing community of practitioners of meditation and contemplation that are activists, and it's really wonderful to see. But there's also a strange debate that comes up that I find strange. That is it more important to be an activist or an inner contemplative? And that's as if those things were opposed. And so I've been kind of just thinking about how they're so not opposed and in fact complementary. And so lately my thoughts have been about how to create a discourse within a community in which inner transformation and outer action are deeply intertwined and, in fact, inseparable in a certain way. So that's been something I've been thinking about, that we don't have to choose between devoting a life to inner pilgrimage and devoting a life to outer activism and transformation, that those two things can and perhaps need to be married. And so I've just been thinking about that lately, and teaching about it a little bit in my community, finding a voice around that. And also, this is a much more personal reflection, thinking about the power of being in the present moment, and versus all the forces that pull us into conceptual planning, and especially with regard to this particular issue, which is so critical, the issue of the Earth's future, how we are pulled into worrying about the future, and worrying maybe being the least that we do, up to being anxious, deeply anxious about the future of our planet, and what happens when we end up devoting more of our attention to the present moment, what that does to behavior, and to this just a natural slowing down. And I sometimes wonder about how could we bring more of that into the world in general, so that that could be very transformative, even for the planet, taking time to slow down and be present with what we have, and love it.
Some more. So since the climate march, the climate march was a bit of a turning point for me in a way, following the experience we had, and then going to the climate march, because I felt so much energy and thought it was just phenomenal to have almost 400,000 people there, and to be in there and moving in this river of people. It was amazing. And I felt very inspired by that, but quickly realizing that the media coverage was so minimal, I did get pretty depressed and down. But then I started thinking, and this has been carrying me through the year a little bit, and that is to back away from my elitism and my privilege a little bit. So, when we get angry with people, such as in the current political climate, and we can't understand other people's actions, and we get upset with how the rest of the, so many of even our colleagues are responding to the climate crisis. You can get really angry, but I also realize we come from a place of privilege. We have the privilege of the knowledge, and we have the privilege of the education, we have the privilege of being able to share these kind of things because of brilliant people like yourselves. And a lot of people don't have that privilege. And they are grasping in the same way we are for solutions, but just in a different way. And they're looking for a hero, they're looking for a way out, they're looking for another way to deal with what they conceive as the current crisis. So part of this year, I've been trying to back away from the the blame game or the despair about people, and just say, you are coming from a place of privilege, you are, elite, and that's sort of in a bad way. I mean, it's a privilege, but it's also makes you an elite person. And so with that comes duty, so we have to find a way to deal with this. If we have this knowledge, we have the duty. And so I've been sort of dealing with that and actually speaking to people about it, particularly people that are, very outspoken about how angry they are with dumb or stupid people. And that upsets me to hear people do that. I think we really have to come from a point that we have to lower our own, or just see where we come from too, which is a very different place and a very lucky and privileged place. The other thing that I've been trying to do is to be a little bit more of a light rather than a pessimist. And we all have to work on that, I know. And I've been dragged down more into pessimism this year than normal. And so in the public talks that I've given, I've really shifted the amount of the public of what I talk about to optimism and what we can do. The message resonates so much more strongly than how bad it's going to be. And even though they might be small and we don't quite believe them ourselves, and maybe your soul's not quite, knowing what we know and how difficult it is and how we are going to lose some things that we care about, but actually trying to give people that, building the vision that you were talking about yesterday, giving people some kind of vision of what we can do. And so that's the other thing that I've been working out on this year. So it's basically combating pessimism with myself, having more compassion for people, and basically just trying to find solutions. On the concrete scale, I've been trying to work on a reef restoration project. I've been trying to get this going. It's tremendous. There's a lot of people behind it, but even in my own ranks, there is a lot of combating of why bother. And so there's polarization in everything we're trying to do. And so I'm trying to concentrate on what's less on the urgent things, more on the important things, if you guys are familiar with the important and unimportant versus urgent versus non-urgent. I'm really trying to not tackle these small urgent things, but the big, long-term important things.
Well, I think the first thing I want to say is just how grateful I am for the circle. It's already doing its magic again. In my constantly on-the-go life, I just don't have nearly enough of, the turning off of the emails and all the rest of it to have this kind of conversation, even though I am deeply convinced that that's what we need to have a lot more of. So many things came up in what you said, and I guess maybe the place to start is the chronological one. So after we closed and you all went off to the climate march, I went off to my vision quest. And that was a very, very, very profound experience for me, and I've been trying to live into the, what came of that for me ever since. One of the things I did, and it might sound paradoxical on some level, is that I completely and utterly and totally buried my being a scientist or defining myself in that way, and all that comes with, with all the gratitude and being done. that one might experience around a funeral of something. So it was a funeral of an identity in some ways. And, what's paradoxical, of course, is that I've since then continued to earning my living with that particular activity, but with a very different attitude and sense about what it is meant to do. And it's come out most clearly for me in the talks that I give. And contrary to what you're just saying, I do not just try to give people hope or optimism, but give them a space to first sit with the gravity of having a few years before we make, decisions that have impacts for 10,000 years, and sit with the grief of it, and sit with the despair of it, because I don't think we can jump from over that. I really believe, I'm more convinced than ever, that the work we have to do is psychological, on a really profound level, individually and collectively. And, we had this conversation last night about how difficult it is to live with or to, coexist and work with, I think, with people who are broken emotionally in some ways, because it's there. And I see it everywhere I go, and it's been a really difficult year for me in this regard, of how much people claim to be leaders, whatever, and do something, and then they just act out of such brokenness and such ego-centeredness and such smallness, where I'm not hearing courage, I'm not hearing clarity as per your book and anything. It's just muddled human crap. And those are the people who are in positions of making decisions, those 10,000-year decisions, and it's crazy making and, really challenging. And then I'm sitting in a car with someone who just tells me about how, there is no way to, I'm not talking about you, who just doesn't think there's a way to make any choice, that there is, it's other people who all make those choices. So I feel like we need to tap into some deep, sustaining source and powerful source to bring people back into actively working toward life in ways that, we are now nowhere near, and none of the political candidates is even beginning to be near. We haven't tapped that well, which is why I'm actually back here. This is what I want. I just put it right out there. I want us to think how we can tap that well, because we need something far more profound to go through, the kind of despair and destruction and what will be social conflict on many levels. So it's been a struggle for me to sit with that, to find the answer of what that work for me is. But I don't think it is, even though I earn my living as a scientist, it is scientific work that will be the answer. It feels psychological, sacred, divine, priestly, whatever kind of work, as opposed to scientific work. And maybe it's artistic, I don't know, but it's a whole different level than politics or any of the other stupid stuff we do on a regular basis. And, not saying there isn't a point of it, but that's not where we will find the answers, I don't think. I guess the last thing I want to say is that through all of this, I feel the weight of it really heavily sitting with me. The grief of it, the weight of that work, and what really am I going to do with my few years of whatever? I won't get to retire. I don't have that luxury, but the years I have, which could be anything from days to 30, 40 years, who knows? So it feels really like a big responsibility. And I don't mean that in any self-centered way. It just feels like it's that weighty.
I think everybody knows how good it is for us all to hear echoed in our friends the kind of concerns that we have. Because what you say about feeling shattered and feeling the urgency of the moment and not knowing how to respond, to knowing that you must respond, the time is short, you have to bring the best you can to the situation, and knowing that you are fractured in some way and you have multiple roles. You are a mother, you are, in my case, a grandmother, and a philosopher and an activist, and how can I, which is most important, and how can I do that? I am torn between what you called the small and urgent and the larger and longer term. I feel like a piece of just a drop of water that someone has just gone smack and just sent it in all directions. And trying very hard to figure out how to respond. Socrates said that philosophers should be gadflies, and that they should go around and they should bite, people who need to be bitten. And I feel more like a botfly, that I'm laying eggs in people's noses. And when people say, how do you describe your work? I say, well, I feel that I'm a philosophical first responder. That when a philosophical emergency arises, I'm driven to go into that place, fire off that article, lay those eggs, and let them fester. And it's frantic because there are lots of emergencies. This book, The Great Tide Rising, that just came out in February, one thing I want to be sure to say about that is deeply in my heart is the debt of gratitude I owe you for your insights. You are there in every page of that book. Sometimes you're named, and sometimes your ideas are there, deeply embedded in the questions. But what that book did was it took the hardest questions that people are asking me, and it tried to answer them. So have we met the enemy, and is it actually us? And what am I supposed to do? And is there any hope? And so writing that book forced me into this morass that we're all struggling to escape. So how do we decide? When I try to decide what to do, and I think I hear all of us are saying, what am I going to do? I mean, of all the things I could do, what am I going to do? I think I have 3 kind of rules that I tell myself. The first rule is, whatever choice I make, it has to be joyous. It has to feed me, or it's not sustainable. And that comes from you, Beth, this notion that anything that can be sustained has to in some way reward us or make us feel joyous. The second is, it has to be something that I feel that I'm uniquely qualified to do. If someone else can do it, maybe I won't have to. And then the third is, it has to be on a scale of importance that matches the urgency of the moment, and that's the hard one. How do I find that? So I'm trying to filter all this emergency responding through the lens of those 3 things. This next book that's coming out in the fall is a novel. And for a while I thought, well, maybe what you need to be, Kathy, is a storyteller. And maybe what you need to do is respond to this thing about, well, what is the other way? Is there another way? I mean, or is this crazy making way of life a given? So the novel begins with a man who is literally making a killing in a southeast Alaskan town and is confronted then by a woman who comes in and is searching for an enduring way of life. Most recently, I was blown away by somebody, and I should know who it is, who said, human beings are complex creatures because we are perhaps uniquely the creatures who have the ability to turn around, gaze into this universe, and be blown away by wonder and astonishment and awe and love. We recognize that we are living in this most extraordinary of, maybe uniquely extraordinary place in the universe. We have this ability for awe and wonder and gratitude and respect. And at the same time, we're the creatures who are tearing it limb for limb, decimating it, leaving it impoverished. It's just crazy what we're doing. So I thought, my next work, I'm going to try to go after the wonder, particularly in regard to my rule number 1. It has to be joyous work. And I'm going to try to give some voice, not to the second part, that we are the most extraordinarily destructive force that has ever evolved, but go with the first part, that the world that we evolved into is so beautiful, it is so irreplaceable that it calls us to treat it with loving care. And so I'm heading into the desert. I'm sending myself into the desert next couple months, and then into Alaska, where I'm going to set aside the work of the moment, and I am going to try to go after writing that will be about gratitude and awe. I probably can't do it. You know, you can't leave the urgency of the moment, but that's going to be what I'm trying. And I owe the courage of that to you, courageous women.
I think you can do it. I don't think I know of anybody else who can do it the way you can do it. You can uniquely do it. This circle, yes, it's been amazing. It is amazing. What a gift. So I think I'll start with something I did fairly recently. I told Will and Sarah I went on a 7-day silent retreat at a beautiful place called Spirit Rock in the hills of Marin, founded by Jack Cornfield, who's excuse me, one of the 60s guys who went off and discovered Buddhism and brought it back to us. There are several of those guys, and then there are a few women, thank God, who came later. It was a metta retreat, Lovingkindness. That was the focus of it, for 7 days of silence and some structure around it. Beautiful setting. It was extraordinary. I mean, many of you, it was about being completely present in doing one thing and only one thing for 7 days, being fully present, being fully focused on metta, on loving kindness, on finding that place within oneself, nurturing it, cultivating it, making up a kind of mantra and saying it over and over. First it sounds kind of silly, walking around saying, I will embody loving kindness. I will be held in love. I will be patient and at ease. May I be glad, wise, and strong. Walking around saying that to yourself for 7 days in your head. And realizing that in doing that, you truly are reprogramming your mind, in a sense, disciplining your mind in a new way to be conscious and aware and receiving the the wondrous gifts that come to you at every turn, if only you can be awake to experience them. So that was profound for me. I've had these really unusual and extremely privileged encounters with the Dalai Lama that few have had, to the extent that I have few living people. I don't know why that happened to me or what it means, but so I felt at the beginning of that retreat, and I feel now that I'm standing on a threshold of some kind, and there's some new step I need to take off into an unknown place. It's now been 9 years since I left the Wellesley presidency. My successor is leaving, and her successor has been selected. I spent these 9 years in governance and leadership and governance on boards and learning about that, and organizations I carefully selected because I admired what they were doing. And because of this circle, I think gradually what I've been doing is dropping, one by one, dropping the ones that give me the least promising sight lines into this climate emergency. So they all in some way had connections. There were some involved with health and healthcare, clearly that's related. And I'm living this question, we're all living this question. What is next? What is next for me? How can I bring whatever it is that I have to this terrifying moment that we're living in? And there is this this awareness of interconnection. And one of the things that I've been attending to carefully are the mechanisms, organizations, the places where people are creating the ability for others to experience themselves as part of a larger whole. And that was what this retreat was about. But it's also what one of these giant MOOC courses is about, this one that I've been supporting and been involved with at MIT, that one of Beth's colleagues has developed and continues to develop, where it's a online course that is a social movement, very self-consciously a social movement. This is called ULab, and a man named Otto Scharmer, who's brilliant, has been developing it, and through stages. And so there, I think for me maybe the biggest question is how to move from either or to both and then beyond both and to some larger synthesis of all of these different possibilities, so we don't get stuck in the dichotomies and the polarization. Somehow, how do you keep raising it up? And I think, Joni, you're so right about the blame and shame. Clearly that's not working. But so one of the things that struck me, and I'll stop, this morning, just in the beautiful meditation that you led for us, I stayed on the MIT Corporation and on the executive committee because that's a point of leverage, I believe, where there's a tremendous amount of power and potential, even though there's also David Koch. Let me talk about contradictions. And these students, these wonderful fossil-free students, are still sitting in. They never stopped, even though it was so clear they're not ever going to get anywhere. They just quietly and respectfully sit outside the president's office. I love these kids. They don't give up. And neither does David Koch. So, but is there some larger question that can be asked there? So the thing that struck me just is, we've given up on divestment. MIT will not divest. There is just no way they're going to do it, at least not now. So to go back to the vice president for research, who's leading this project that I had a big role, I think, in affecting, and say to her, okay, Maria, divestment is off the table, but the goal is we have to keep the stuff in the ground. That's the slogan, that's the goal. It cannot be dug up and it cannot be burned, and there has to be a way that MIT can be contributing that, even to that, in our conversations with Exxon. That has to be a very clear and specific goal. And let's get thinking about that, and what is it that MIT can be doing about that. So just looking for different ways to frame these questions. And then there's the whole presidential election and Hillary, and I spent a night at the White House with Hillary. I mean, I know her pretty well. So is there leverage there? So it's a very odd situation. I feel that I have these relationships and connections. Madeleine Albright, I was just with her. I don't think I'm using them very effectively, and I'm sitting with the question of what is it that I need to be doing, and we all are, anyway. Not very coherent.
Well, I think I'm just going to cut to the chase and say that I have felt really lucky that in some ways it's really obvious that as a full professor in a university, you just figure out how to work on the illumination of that environment in light of this situation. You know, it just has felt very natural to turn to the whole question of what does it mean to be with young people these days, and we've got to change that in relationship to what we're facing. And so that's what I've been doing, in addition to continuing to think about us and the spin-offs of us, that there will hopefully be one with Joni, and Diana and I are mucking around with Wellesley and thinking about connections there, and I've just been facilitating a council at Edinboro that I've told some of you about. Wonderful women. It really would be amazing to bring that group and our group together. And there are other people who are interested in doing this, and it's been a foundational practice now at Clark. So we are doing now our second group of faculty council, and I've done 2 with groups of students, and they take to this deeply and gratefully and do the full cycle of grieving and emerging. Some of it has to be cushioned in a longer process. I think it was my sacred space class that I had the most successful time with, because they had a full introduction to the questions within the context of a sacred, joyous approach to our relationship to the natural world. So they had I think they were able to go through the process more, but they did. And there are now a group of students who are going to be not only facilitating council in our next teach-in at Clark, but also then spreading it as practice with students. And I know it has to be done very carefully, because this is very difficult territory without support. So in any case, back to the Clark's situation, it has unfolded in these ways that are both encouraging and just incredibly frustrating. The amount of inertia and blinkeredness and overwhelm that all of us, our colleagues, have. You know, they're still struggling to just have these multidimensional lives that have enormous responsibilities, everything from their, 2-year-old twins. I was telling people last night, one of the women in our faculty is a specialist a geographer working on the trauma that's going on in the Arctic, and she has 2 twins, 2 years old, and she can't emerge enough to be part of what we're doing because she's so overwhelmed. And she wants to. So there's a really deep struggle to alter the business as usual energy field, right? To actually disrupt it. But we're doing this thing. I brought everybody little books about it, and this is the initiative, A New Earth Conversation, and all the different parts to it for this semester. We're doing it for a year as this kind of, just major leavening and transformation type, trying to catalyze through trio conversations. I mean, talk about the wisdom in this room that's in this work. There's so many and much of you in what we're doing. Kathy had told me about that trio process, and that's a big foundational part of what we're doing. Every month we do one. We're doing council, we're doing public events that we have dialogue after, and then we have the teach-in coming, so we're building all of these new conversations across disciplines, asking people to show up to 3 major questions. I should share those with you, and then and create conversations rather than presentations, and see if we're going to have people waking up to this in ways that they hadn't imagined. And I think it's both happening and not happening. And I get really tired at times. I have wonderful colleagues that are really good at moments, but they don't really hold it. It's okay, it's okay. It is what it is. So I feel very blessed right now to have a sense that where I am and what I'm working on feels like it needs attention, it should be happening. We could maybe get some way that other institutions see that they need to take up the question at this level, because we're really asking the institution to say, what is higher education doing at this time? And Susie came as one of our advisory board and really raised great questions for us of what does it mean, what do we want our students to be when they're to have as systems thinking, to have become those who listen, who are able to be present to a different kind of being after their education. And so I'm hoping that we actually, through this process, are willing to, in some ways, reinvent on some institutional level what we do. I don't know if that's going to happen or not, but that's what I'm laying the foundation for. Let's see. We've got retreats. I didn't mention those. So then we go into these deep plunges and ask what's the possibility here in terms of the forms of the things we do and the kinds of questions we ask, and how can we see our roles differently? And if we come up with something that is interesting and workable, I hope it can end up being a catalyst for others. And so right now there's a kind of good momentum, and I don't wake up in the morning. I wake up with heaviness every morning, and a sense of the responsibility, and a sense of the grief, and the sense of the joy. And then I feel, okay, today I know that I have something that needs to be done. I see that it won't last forever, and but now is a good day. This is a really good day. But this work with this one little institution is meaning a lot to me. And I feel really happy to be so old and so like beyond worrying. It frees me up so beautifully to say the things that need to be said. I can go to the president and just speak really truthfully, which is so nice. Who would have ever guessed? So, and amazingly, you know, everyone says yes when you ask them to get involved with, you know, things like panels and questions and doing the trios. They want to do it. That's heartening. That's heartening. Because, you know, they might not. Some of them don't. But anyway, that's the heart of it.
Yeah, I'm having that experience of coming almost at the end of the circle, and there's threads, which is beautiful and tangled in my mind. I just finished reading the newest book by Brene Brown called Rising Strong. Has any of you read Rising Strong by Brene Brown? It's about a lot of things that are really, really relevant to what we're talking about. But the part that I'm thinking of is she interviewed people who are storytellers and filmmakers, and they identified for her this pattern, which is actually traces back, Joseph Campbell named it, in The Hero's Journey, where the hero sets out and then basically tries everything that he or she can think of that already is known, and none of it works. That's the classic story. And it's only after trying everything that doesn't work that in the last moment the hero is pushed to something new, and that's sort of creativity in her mind. And I kind of think that's where we're at, you know, that every possible thing that we thought ought to work, some technological thing, you know, elect Obama, you know, all these, and of course many people are still clinging to a lot of those, and part of our work at Climate Interactive is the kind of, no, we ran the numbers, that one won't work, that's not, you know, that one won't work, that one won't work, which is a hard role to play sometimes, to be that voice, but I think is also like the only way we find the disruption of the status quo, that the energy field of the business as usual, is by sinking into that, you know, it's actually it's something totally different that we haven't thought of yet. So that was what rose up for me listening to all of you. In terms of my journey since last September, I had that same feeling as you, Joni, of being in that massive river of people, and I grabbed back on that feeling for energy a lot of time. You know, it's so fascinating to have been part of this tiny little organization that partly by luck, partly by grit and audacity, really was listened to for a while and really reflected back to the world what the world was trying to do. You know, and some of that I shared with you all, things like the New York Times article and just lots of coverage in Paris when we were adding up the numbers. And then other things that we can't talk about but are fascinating, of being, you know, invited to advise people who seemingly could make a difference, and this sort of combined shock of like, they don't have anyone who could tell them that, you know, that the opposite perspective to what we had in the car, Susie, of, you know, those people who are running it all know exactly what they're doing and they're out to screw us. It's actually nobody knows what they're doing, which is scarier, right, in some ways. And Paris and all its complexity of some things that were much better than anybody hoped, and all of it being totally insufficient. And the biggest question for me, though, you know, about Paris and that whole process is is it even framed to do what needs to be done? Or is it framed within that story of the hero trying everything he knew, but it can't possibly produce what needs to happen? And I'm cautious about, giving up too soon on something that it could be doing good, is doing good. And I think it's maybe not either or, but it's just to not put all of our energy into that process. And the things about it, that are never really questioned within this sort of totally internally consistent world, is that this is a problem to be solved by nations, that we think about emissions as coming from nations where they're produced, not where the stuff that they were made is consumed. Like, the whole picture would look totally different if all of the accounting and pledges were based on where CO2 was used. And then we wouldn't be wagging our fingers at China, in this thing that sort of is so hard to move. And then, a lot of what my work since September has been on is, what if, instead of looking so narrowly just at carbon, what if we just widened our view and saw all of the things that are interconnected to carbon? Because there's so many solutions that we're just overlooking because if it's just viewed as who's going to give up their right to produce carbon, it's this battle. You widen it a little bit, and it's like, who's going to get all those health benefits? Who's going to get, all of that well-being and mental health and physical health and new jobs? And so the most tragic thing about all this, and the more I do the research, the more tragic it is the extent to which this transition is so good for so many people, and yet we're resisting it out of I don't know what. But for that flip to the positive, it actually, I don't think it's like trying to drum up optimism. It's like restating the question in a way where that answer is so beautiful and joyous and seductive. And I'm now just convinced by the math that that's not a pipe dream. It's not a story or a narrative or something we make up. It's actually a feature of the systems of the planet. But we're so attached to this other story that we live in the best possible way right now, and that any shift from that is going to be a sacrifice. And that story is just completely, completely wrong. And you don't have to get very far outside the bubble of, white privileged people to see how badly the world is working for most people. And so it's this weird, then the sort of narrow white environmental movement feels all sorry for itself, right? That, we don't have enough people to win any kind of political battles. And again, that being unable to look at a solution that maybe gives you 95% of the carbon benefit instead of 100, but gives you, 3x, 50x, 500x health benefit, or jobs for people who, aren't concerned about climate but don't have a job and their kid has asthma. And so I have this just incredible impatience and frustration at not being able to articulate that other way of seeing it, where I actually think it's a solvable thing. So my, maybe a big theme of my journey since our last time together is just frustration at seeing something and not getting enough, feeling like I have enough traction of explaining it or making it appealing. And I think that'll be the biggest tragedy of all if we stay in this frame that's unsolvable too much longer, when just right around the corner is this other way of looking at it.
Well, I've had a strange odyssey this year. I started getting a lot of requests to contribute to conferences described as cybernetics. And because both of my parents were involved in the early cybernetics meetings, I said, that's not me. And the first one was a request to write a chapter for a book on human computation. And I checked out human computation on Google, my prime source of information. And I said, I don't know anything much about that. And I wrote back and said, you gave me a deadline, you want this thing in 2 months. It would take me a year to figure out any of this. I can't do it. So he writes back again and says, all right, write the preface. This is a book that is this thick. And I said, I haven't got time to read the abstracts. Never mind the fact that the articles aren't all turned in. And I was getting crankier and crankier and crankier about this whole thing. So I sat down at the computer, having spent some time on Google and gone to articles and read them and tried to figure out what they're talking about. And I wrote 1,000 words. Was all I could think of to say about human computation. And I send it off to him. And I get back this email that starts out, shivers went down my back. You've just written exactly what I wanted. And basically what I was trying to write was an answer to the question of how individuals think about how their efforts can combine so that positive or negative behavior counts. I may have sent out this piece to you before. If I haven't, I will. It's called Learning to Count, and I mean it as a pun. That's what we're trying to do, is learning to count. But the point is, this was coming at me. I mean, this has now happened 5 times in the past year, and what I've realized that it is precisely the issue of thinking systemically. And that when you look at the early years of cybernetics, Wiener's definition was the science of communication and control. And the word cybernetics comes from the Greek word for the steersman. You know, how do you find your way through a very complicated, how do you keep balance? And that what happened with the incredible glamour of the computer and its economic importance was that the systems theory part of cybernetics got lost. And in fact, when we talk about how to reopen these questions, partly in society, but also in the academic world, the loss of cybernetics, the loss of the capacity to recognize the same pattern replaying itself in multiple settings, for instance, is critical. And you cannot have, but on the other hand, you cannot have a science of ethics that is not based on a theory of causation. And basically, systems theory is a rethinking of causality. Instead of the lineal version, it's the systems causation. And so having been very cross and resistant to this whole thing initially, I suddenly realized that is the language that we have to be talking. And we have to be speaking it in a way that does what cybernetics, which was originally designed to do, was to allow analogies from different areas of natural phenomena, social phenomena, psychological phenomena, and see the resonances and see how things fit together. I have a friend who was part of this. He came to me, he'd read some of my father's stuff and discovered that I existed and wanted to know more about systems theory, and I started giving him more stuff to read. And he says, what we have to do is we have to solve the Israeli-Arab problem. Israeli-Palestinian problem. And I bet we can solve it by looking at it from a systems theory point of view, instead of in terms of negotiation, which says that, you've got these two sides and everything is through representatives. And he managed to get in touch with people at the program on negotiation at Harvard, and we gave a seminar on systems thinking about the Israeli-Arab conflict. And I thought back to a wonderful book that came out, I guess, probably in the 60s, called Getting to Yes by Roger Fisher, about negotiation. Still one of the Bibles. And I thought, no, the issue is not getting to yes. The issue is getting to we, but not in French. And that is really it. We to think systemically about climate change and other areas of damage that's being done to our Goldilocks planet is thinking of each of these issues as we in the ocean, we in the rainforest, we in the movement of the gases in the upper atmosphere, because they're all connected, just as they are in complexity theory, where people talk about a butterfly flaps his wings in China, and it has to do with a hurricane in the Caribbean or whatever. That it's the interconnection. So, I mean, I still have to say I'm profoundly ignorant. I never studied this stuff, but I used to sit at the breakfast table and listen to it by the hour. But that's really, I mean, I think I heard the word systems. I heard being able to think of ourselves as part of, what are we part of, and how are we part? And the other thing that's weird in my life is in the past year I've had 4 different people suggest writing a book together. Mainly people who are not social scientists, who feel that there has to be the one I actually said yes to, but we haven't gotten terribly far, is a colleague who is an immunologist with whom I wrote a book about HIV a few years ago. He's African American. He has written a book about the biology of race. He wants to write a book about race. Well, race is something that developed in the human species as a result of living in different climate environments. And that's A. And B, it is non-whites that are going to be most profoundly hurt by the changes that are happening around the world, whether it's South Pacific Islanders, or people living at the pole, near the poles, people in Africa, people living where the deserts are, the wars that develop. Wars, people think they're wars of religion, but the Arab Spring was about climate change. The refugee emergency that we're having at the moment all around the world, it's about climate change. And once you make the ethical connection between how you think about causation and how you describe things, the issue of how to describe things, how to get people involved, at what scale to speak, changes completely. And a lot of what we think is knowledge has to be reworked because it's out of context. It's decontextualized. It's reductionist. So I'm at the point of feeling very stupid. I think that's important. I think realizing that it's our habits of thought, it's our epistemology. It's the things we take into account. I want more cotton to grow in my cotton field. That's not a bad thing, that's a good thing. Ah, but there's a boll weevil, so I'll spray it with DDT. DDT is a good thing, it's going to give me more cotton. No, DDT is not a good thing. And so what you have to take into account for every decision, if you want it to be an ethical decision, has totally changed. If you think in systems theory, what is the larger system that will be disrupted by this? And the climate is, it's obviously it's the most urgent at the moment, but it's a metaphor for the way we are destroying systems by making what we think are reasonable, sensible decisions, but they're too narrow. We don't understand that causation is knit together. Everything's connected to everything. So I've had to switch completely to me. And I can't tell you how cranky I was. I was furious. And all these people that wanted me to talk about something, I said, I don't know anything about it. But that's step one, beginner's mind.
Thank you. Thank you. I love that.
I don't think you did send it to us. We'd love to see it.
Yeah.
I don't think you did send it to us. We'd love to see it. That article, that preface you wrote.
I will.
Yeah,
I will.
good.
No, I sent you. What I sent out was a much shorter piece.
Right.
It was dealing with it, but it was.
Well, it's embodying the
Yeah, I
next
agree.
move, which is this is time for our break. And this was perfect. Thank you.